Well, welcome everyone. This is our May installment of the Division 34 2021 webinar series. Division 34, if you're not already aware, is the Society for Environmental, Population, and Conservation Psychology, a division of the American Psychological Association. And we're excited today to welcome Dr. Nathaniel Geiger, or Nathan, from Indiana University Bloomington. His talk, as you can see here on the slide, is titled "Not All Boomers: An Initial Exploration of When and Why Older Adults Are Less Engaged with Climate Change." Dr. Geiger is an assistant professor of communication science in the media school at Indiana University Bloomington, and that's where he conducts his experimental and survey research in lab, field, and online settings. His work examines how people become motivated and empowered to take action on climate change and other environmental issues. He's particularly interested in understanding how engagement with topics like climate change can be influenced by interpersonal relationships and perceptions of other groups in society. Nathan received his PhD in social psychology from Penn State University before moving to Indiana to take his current position. He has published work in a variety of cross-disciplinary journals, including Environmental Communication, the Journal of Environmental Psychology, Environment and Behavior, Science Communication, Group Processes and Interpersonal Relations, and Bioscience. And his work has been featured in popular press outlets such as the Washington Post. Today, Nathan will present an initial exploration of the psychological reasons why older adults are sometimes less engaged with climate change than our younger generations. The two studies presented examine whether cultural and interindividual differences in temporal orientation moderate the tendency for older adults to be less engaged with climate change than younger adults. Please feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat to post questions throughout this talk, and we'll have some time at the end to address your questions. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Nathan.
I'm muted. I think you may need to enable me for screen sharing so I can share my screen.
Make sure that is set up. All right, let's see if that works now.
Great. Yeah, I think I should be able to do that now. All right, can everybody see this?
Yes, looks good.
Great. All right. Well, yeah, this is some work that I did with my colleague John Velez here at Indiana University and Brian McLaughlin at Texas Tech. And I realized at some point, I think I had agreed to present something else during this time, and so I'm sorry if anybody came for that. I had some other work on climate change and immigration and messaging around that issue, which it's been a semester. So this is what I ended up presenting today. If anyone is curious about any of that work, if you came here for that work, feel free to reach out. Here's my email right here. I'd be happy to share what we have with you. But I hope if you did come for that, I hope you'll stick around for this. I think this will be some work that you might be interested by as well. And what this work really stemmed from, sort of some of the motivating forces behind this work, was this sort of emerging discourse that we noticed in society, sort of beginning, I think this has always been around to some extent, but we saw this sort of picking up a few years ago, where we saw this youth movement emerging around climate change. People like Greta Thunberg and many other people, that these sort of people that were becoming engaged with climate change and who are highly visible, in the media and other places, seem to be, often the youth. And of course, there was some out there that, were critical of this, sort of criticizing. This sort of plays in, I think, for some people, into the stereotypes that people have about millennials and Gen Z, about them being immature and sort of brainwashed or whatever. And then, of course, on the other end, you had stereotypes about older people and how older people behaved in society. And so Most provocatively, of course, you have this book that came out in 2017, Bruce Cannon Gibney, who's essentially arguing that the baby boomer generation was really irresponsible. I wanted to talk to him and ask him, how do you really feel about the baby boomer generation? It's unclear from the title of your book. So pretty harsh here. But of course, this is sort of plays into this broader narrative about how maybe older adults feel about younger people and stereotypes about younger people, that younger people like to eat avocado toast and like to spend money on frivolous things. And then stereotypes about older people that, they don't believe in climate change or some of these other things. And of course, many of you are probably familiar with the saying, I believe it became popular probably sometime in the last couple of years, where people started saying, okay, boomer. It's just sort of this idea, it reflects sort of this notion that older adults as a generation are out of touch with social problems such as climate change and all these sorts of things. So these are sort of the stereotypes that I think have emerged in our society over the last few years, right? With the stereotypes about younger people and the stereotypes about older adults. And of course, we can think of lots of examples of older adults that don't fit this narrative, right? So just to give one example here, we have Jay Inslee. He's the governor of Washington State. And he was one of the many Democratic candidates that ran for president in the primary for 2020. And so, his argument was that it's important for, older generations to be engaged with climate change. And, it's important to he sort of wanted to have this call to action to say, hey, other people in my generation, we need to be engaged with climate change as well. And so maybe there are a fair number of older adults that already are fairly engaged with climate change. And of course, we can think of some really prominent examples in the environmental community of older adults who are engaged with climate change. People like Bill McKibben, Al Gore, former vice president, who's been really involved with the climate change movement. And down here, these are people that might be a little bit less famous, but they have had large contributions to the environmental movement as well. This is Wendell Berry. Lives in Kentucky, not too far actually, a couple hours away from where I am here in Indiana. And this is Dr. Robert Bullard, who's been known as the father of the environmental justice movement. So these are all older adults who have had, pretty prominent impact on climate change and the environmental movement, and continue to do so, even now that many of them are well into their, late 50s, 60s, 70s. Some cases older. We can think of probably many women who would fit this as well. But this sort of goes to show that even older men often are very engaged with these things in many cases, right? So we can think of many of these counterexamples. So when I first started, sort of thinking about this topic, one of the things I wanted to look at, I was like, well, I'm sure there's a lot of literature out there on the relationship between age and climate engagement. And so I started doing sort of literature review on that. And not surprisingly, there is a fair amount of work on that. Not as much, perhaps, as you might think, given the fact that almost all studies measure age. There's not as much research that's actually looked at this relationship as you might think. But overall, there is a lot of research out there that shows that there is a weak to moderate relationship between age and reduced willingness to engage in pro-environmental behavior. So this is just one example here, Casey and Scott. But there's a number of examples that tend to show that relationship is there. It's not super strong, but it is there, and it does seem to be something that a lot of folks have found. But it's also important to note that this relationship shows significant variance based on both country and issue. So Pertinga et al., 2019, this was a study looking at cross-national data in Europe, and they found that in certain parts of Europe, there was much stronger of an age relationship than in other parts of Europe. The age relationship between age and concern about climate change, or seeing it as a priority. It was a little bit weaker, for example, in Eastern Europe, that their tendency for older adults to be see climate change as less of a priority was a weaker in Eastern Europe than Western Europe. And then similarly, this was a study conducted in China, and they found this interesting pattern where they showed that older adults and younger adults were both, in many cases, concerned about many environmental issues, but that the relationship between age and concern about the issue differed depending on the issue. So they found that on average, older adults actually tended to be a little bit more concerned about local pollution in their area. And younger adults, in contrast, tended to be a little bit more concerned about some more these global abstract issues, such as climate change. Now, they didn't specifically focus on climate change as a priority in this one, but you could imagine that climate change would sort of fit that pattern, that it's sort of a more abstract issue that, based on their findings, it's possible that younger adults might be more concerned about than older adults, which is consistent with some of the other work out there. Although, again, it's not a super strong relationship. So these are sort of the, sort of bivariate relationships or sort of correlational studies looking at what the relationship is between age and pro-environmental behavior or climate action or whatever was studied. But what we were really interested in examining in this work is what can psychological theory tell us about why age might relate to climate engagement? So in our opinion, we're really glad that people have done this work and folks have looked at the relationship between age and climate engagement, but we wanted to dig a little bit deeper and look at some theoretical perspectives behind the aging process and how people might relate to climate change as a result. And so the theoretical perspective that we're relying on most heavily here derives from socio-emotional selectivity theory. This is Laura Carstensen. She's been doing work on this for over 30 years. And this comes primarily from the developmental psychology world. And essentially what her and her colleagues find is that people's priorities shift as they move through the life cycle. And so as you move into young adulthood, you realize that you're fairly young and you have a lot of time left, or seemingly have a lot of time left in the world. And so one of the things you may be sort of looking to do is learn about things. For example, you might want to learn things so that you can be more successful in your career, or you might want to learn things that you're hoping to use later in life. Or you might want to, for example, reach out and connect with new friends, right? Younger adulthood is a time where a lot of folks want to make new friends, connect with new people, experience new things. And of course, many older adults enjoy doing those things as well. But on average, as folks get older, the tendency on average, is to prioritize exploring the world and learning about things a little bit less, and prioritize things that are emotionally meaningful a bit more as people get older. And so on average, these emotion needs tend to go up. Now, of course, there are a lot of older adults who are still interested in learning new things. My dad, for example, he retired, and he's been actually taking, a lot of universities have these programs where senior citizens can take classes after they retire for a low price. And so he's been, taking advantage of that. So I'm not trying to say that older adults are not interested in learning new things, but just that the relative sort of priorities shift. And in some cases, the types of things that older adults are interested in learning might change. They might be interested in learning things that better fit what seems emotionally meaningful to them. So there's sort of this increased priority on finding things that feel emotionally meaningful and delving in more depth into those things. And so we see that in many regions, perhaps as a result of this, self-reported happiness goes up in later life. And so we see that one of these sort of tenets of socio-emotional selectivity theory is that as people get older, many older people stop worrying about things that perhaps many younger people worry about, that, as you get older, you develop greater perspective on life and you realize those things perhaps aren't important or don't feel important to you. And so Charles et al., this is a socio-emotional selectivity paper, they observed that in their interviews with older adults, it's remarkably common for older adults to explain that they cope with many problems and worries. These older adults would explain how they cope with these things by just stating, I don't think about problems or worries. So this is sort of something that they've observed, that often this is not something that's due to cognitive decline or loss of cognitive functioning. This is just due to shifts in priorities in life. That it's perhaps for older adults doesn't seem meaningful or worthwhile to think about these things that don't feel emotionally meaningful to them. And we see over here on the left that in terms of self-reported happiness, that in many countries, it does go up in later life, perhaps as a result of this. So we see in the United States, for example, it goes up in later life, both for women and for men. And we see overall in the world that it tends to go up over here in later life for women and for men. Now, of course, you can see here also there are a lot of countries here, regions of the world, even though this is the world average, that it does tend to go up in later life. There are many regions that don't fit this pattern. And there's a lot of, we could do a lot of speculation on that, which is probably beyond the scope of the current, research. So for example, could ask, okay, well, are some of these countries, does this reflect like sort of the rapid transition to capitalism over the last 3 decades? Perhaps that sudden transition could have been, jarring for some older adults. But there's many possible explanations for that. And I think we see even for some of these countries where well-being does tend to go down, such as China at least, it does seem to go back up in terms of self-reported well-being near the end of life. So we do see on average that many countries fit this pattern. I think another possible explanation beyond perhaps rapid societal or economic changes in a country could also perhaps be what people tend to focus on as they get older. And so in the US, we tend to focus a lot on certain types of goals. We tend to focus a lot perhaps on hedonic goals, whereas other countries, they might have other priorities in terms of what they see as emotionally meaningful. And so one thing that I think is consistently true, even in the US, this is probably true around the world, is that there are many things that are emotionally meaningful that are not necessarily hedonically pleasant. So one common example that's been identified in terms of something that a lot of older adults find emotionally meaningful is helping close friends and family. And in many cases, this might be something that's stressful or distressing for these older adults. It might be really stressful to, work with kids on learning new things at certain points when they're struggling. Or it might be stressful to help, perhaps your grandchild cope with a stressful event in their life. But these are things that many older adults find emotionally meaningful. And similarly, we see that in laboratory tasks in the US, we see that older adults on average tend to have a preference for positive stimuli over negative stimuli. They tend to avoid the negative stimuli on average in the US. But there is some work, although somewhat inconsistent, there is some work that shows that in East Asian countries, that pattern is not present in East Asian countries, that the older adults in East Asian countries may in some cases not be avoiding those negative stimuli. And that may be in part because these cross-cultural differences lead to those sorts of stimuli being perceived as more emotionally meaningful in those countries than in the US. And so this is, like I said, generally a developmental psychology theory. And what we wanted to do in the present work is think about, well, how do all these things that have been studied in the context of developmental psychology relate to climate engagement? And so one of the things that I think is worth keeping in mind, and we're in the present work, we're focused primarily in the Western context. We are focused on, in the Western context, where climate change, previous work suggests that climate change is perceived as a future issue for most Westerners. A lot of times when we think about climate change, we think about, okay, well, a lot of people recognize the climate is already starting to change and that it's going to continue to change in the near future. But often when we think about the really, really extreme negative effects of climate change, we think about those things as things, being further off in the future. So this is sort of an example of, a future scenario where released by the IPCC, where in 2020 to 2099, there's going to be these, pretty extreme weather shifts. So not surprisingly, a lot of people, think about these things as sort of an abstract future issue. And so then not surprisingly, as a result of that, because, sorry, let me silence my phone real fast. Because many of us think about climate change as an abstract future issue in the West, how we relate to climate change, or the extent to which we engage with climate change, will depend on our relationship to the future and the present. So do we have a temporal engagement where we tend to focus more on the present and engage more with the present? Or do we have a temporal engagement where we tend to find things in the future to be emotionally meaningful and we tend to engage with those? And so previous work has looked at the relationship between temporal orientation and engagement with climate change. And what we wanted to do in this work is extend that to this examination of the relationship between age and climate change. In essence, if older adults get better at sort of tuning out things that don't feel emotionally meaningful, then this effect of temporal orientation on engagement with climate change might be particularly relevant for older adults. And so we see this, we've seen this in past research. There's been a fair amount of research. So for example, Lisa Zaval and Ezra Markowitz did some work, as well as a number of other researchers as well, have done work on legacy motives. They've done work on talking about the legacy that people wish to leave as a motivating factor to motivate people to take action on climate change. And so this is just one example of ways in which people could be oriented towards the future, right? If you're thinking about your legacy, you're focusing more on the future. Over here, we have a traditional proverb. It's often attributed to be a Greek proverb that a society grows great when old men, and I would add women and gender non-binary folks as well, plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in. So we have this sort of recognition that perhaps how successful societies are likely to be really depends on whether these older adults have this future orientation, whether they are behaving in ways to sort of plan for the future and prepare for the future. And so in the present work, we wish to test two hypotheses. First of all, age, on average, we believed age will be negatively associated with climate change engagement. So this is just sort of replicating previous work. But what's novel about this work is we wanted to test whether this relationship here would be moderated by temporal orientation. So we speculated based on socio-emotional selectivity theory and work on temporal engagement that amongst those who are more future-oriented or live in future-oriented cultural contexts, age-related differences in climate engagement will be less pronounced. So in other words, if you're an older adult and you're present-oriented, you might be fairly likely to not be very engaged with climate change. But if you're an older adult and you're future-oriented, you might tend to be more likely to be engaged with climate change because that is something that you might find to be emotionally meaningful. And so in study one, we conducted a test of our hypotheses with a cross-national sample from the European Social Survey. And so this was the European Social Survey is a study that was done, a data collection process that's done with 23 countries in Europe and Israel, which is not in Europe. All the other countries are in Europe. And this is done every 2 years. And we wanted to focus on, in specific, the year of 2016 here, because that's when public attitudes to climate change was collected in that year. So we wish to focus on that year. And we also combined data from Hofstede's Cultural Value Index. They had country-level data on long-term orientation. And fortunately, they have data on this from many countries all over the world. They had data from all 23 of the countries that we were interested in examining. So we were able to take that country-level data on long-term orientation and combine that with some of the country-level and individual-level data from the European Social Survey. So this was, again, data that had been previously collected. We were not involved in this data collection process. And the variables that we took out of that data set, which were relevant to the current research, were age. So we had a pretty wide range. They surveyed people between age 15 and 100, so a pretty wide range of age. We were interested in looking at, like I had said before, we're interested in looking at long-term orientation or temporal orientation as a potential moderator of the relationship between age and climate engagement. And we wanted to make sure that we were really looking at the effect of long-term orientation and not looking at something else like political orientation. So we controlled for political orientation. We asked people about their political orientation on a 0 to 10 left to right scale. And we averaged this at the country level because we had long-term orientation at the country level. And so we wanted to control for this political orientation at the country level. In other words, looking at, are there some countries where people tend to identify as more left-leaning and other countries where people tend to identify as more right-leaning out of those 23 countries? And then our outcome measure was the issue salience of climate change. So we had a 2-item composite, which was how worried are you about climate change and how much have you thought about climate change before today? And so this is sort of a measure of cognitive engagement. How cognitively engaged are you with climate change? And we excluded 2% of the sample who believed that the world's climate was definitely not changing because we thought potentially there could be a different pattern with them. When we included them in the sample, the results were the same. So this didn't influence our results, but we just felt like this would be sort of potentially a different pattern or another moderator that we didn't want to get into. So we're focused on people that are not firmly convinced that climate change is not happening. And so we used multi-level regression. And if this looks like Greek to you, which it sort of is, you don't have to worry about this. But essentially, what I wanted to point out here was we looked at age at the individual level. So we looked at individual people's age. And we looked at long-term orientation and political orientation only at the country level. So this is the long-term orientation by country. Some countries have cultural values that are more oriented towards long-term, some less so. And this was how politically left or right on average each country was in terms of the respondents' political views, political orientation. So these are both at the country level. This is at the individual level. And what we found was a main effective age. So we found that on average, age negatively predicted climate salience. This is, if you're familiar with effect sizes, this looks like a relatively small effect, which is often the case with multi-level modeling. When you do multi-level modeling, you're often going to get pretty small effect sizes, just because there's a lot of variance to be explained. So you're often not going to explain a very big percentage of the variance. And then we also found an interaction between age and temporal orientation. So as we hypothesized, the age salience relationship was moderated by temporal orientation of the country. Again, this effect size looks pretty small, which is, again, what you'd expect with a multi-level model. So I wanted to sort of graphically illustrate what this relationship looked like at the country level. And so basically on the x-axis here, you have long-term orientation. These countries over here are more oriented towards the present, less towards the future. Countries like Ireland, Iceland, Portugal. These countries over here are more oriented towards the future. So we see even across Europe plus Israel, we have pretty decent variation in long-term orientation. It goes from about 25 to well over 75 on a 0 to 100 scale. So we see there's a pretty decent variation in long-term orientation. And here on the y-axis, we have what is the relationship between age and climate salience for each country. And so what we see here essentially is that many countries, on average, there's a negative relationship between age and climate salience. All these countries below the dotted line. That means that younger folks, on average, are a bit more concerned about climate change than older folks. And up here, these countries that are above the dotted line, this is a positive relationship between age and climate salience, meaning that older adults often are a bit more concerned, on average, than younger adults in those countries. And so what we see here is there's a fair amount of variation, as you would expect, in these 23 countries. But we see that on average, the countries that have a more present orientation, they tend to have a stronger negative relationship between age and climate salience, meaning that in these countries, if they're more oriented towards the present, the older adults tend to be less concerned than the younger adults about climate change. And we see with these countries over here that are higher in long-term orientation, although there does seem to be a fair amount of variance at this end, we see that on average, many of these countries have a relationship of close to 0, or even a positive relationship where maybe the older adults think about climate change more than the younger adults. So this supports, in general, supports our hypotheses. We see here there's not an extremely strong relationship in any of these cases. It's all between about Pearson's R of 0.1 and about negative 0.2. So these are all sort of weak to moderate correlations. But it is interesting how it flips, and this is sort of so visible here, in even some of these countries in Europe that have relatively similar cultural contexts in some ways. There's a fair amount of variation across these countries. So in study 2, we wanted to follow this up by looking at temporal orientation at the individual level. And so we conducted study 2 with a US adult sample using the firm Dynata. So this is not a fully representative sample. We do have reason to think it's probably a little bit better quality than the convenience samples like MTurk or whatever else, but it's definitely not perfectly representative. We looked at it is a fairly diverse sample in terms of ethnicity. It has a fairly diverse range of political beliefs, all those sorts of things. So it's a fairly broad sample of US adults. And we made one change to this study that I think is worth mentioning, which is how we measured temporal orientation. So in study 1, we had measured temporal orientation using Hofstede's measure, which was data that was previously collected. And importantly, Hofstede argues that his measure is valid as a cross-cultural measure of temporal orientation, but it should not be used at the individual level to measure individual differences in temporal orientation. So in study 2, we instead focused on a measure of temporal orientation, or you could argue that this might be potentially a little bit different than temporal orientation, but it's essentially measuring a similar construct known as consideration of future consequences. And essentially what this is, to simplify, it's a behavior-oriented measure of temporal orientation. So it essentially asks about, and I'll show you some example items here in a couple slides, but it essentially asks about when you plan for things, when you make decisions and you engage in behavior, do you tend to plan for more for the present or more for the future? And so people high versus low in consideration of future consequences are more persuaded by arguments that highlight future benefits, and they're less persuaded by current benefits. So arguably, this is suggesting that if you are high in CFC, in consideration of future consequences, things that involve the future are going to be more emotionally meaningful to you. You're going to be more focused on those things in the future. And more recent work has suggested, I mentioned above that this was originally looking at the difference between the future benefits and the present benefits. But more recent work, most prominently Jeff Dwerman, actually showed that it's not just two ends of a spectrum, there's actually two dimensions here. So there's actually consideration of future consequences, which is the extent to which you factor the future into decision making. But then there's also consideration of immediate consequences. And it's been argued that consideration of future consequences is more of a cold psychological process. And so it's more of sort of a cold cognitive judgmental process. And consideration of immediate consequences is more of a hot or sort of motivational process that might be a better predictor of low self-control, temporal discounting. And so there's been a number of studies who have separated these two factors. And in some ways, which of these two subdimensions of CFC is most predictive, in some ways is a bit inconclusive, I would argue at this point. So we didn't really have a really solid prediction going into this in terms of which of these two dimensions would better predict engagement with climate change. But importantly, we were not just interested in these things in terms of the main effects. We were also interested in the interaction between each of these two subdimensions in age. So if we think about this in the context of, and this is a previous study. Sorry, I realize I don't have the citation here for this study, so I apologize to the authors of this study for not including their names on this. I should be definitely giving them credit for this. But essentially, this is a possible interaction between consideration of future consequences and another predictor variable with regard to an outcome variable. So this essentially proposes two separate models. This one is the buffering model. And in this case, they're looking at the relationship between compulsive buying tendencies and credit card debt. And they argue that the buffering model would propose that this is moderated by the extent to which people are concerned with future consequences. If you have compulsive buying tendencies, but you're also very concerned about future consequences, you might not be likely to get into credit card debt. The buffering model would argue that it would be the combination of compulsive buying tendencies and low concern with future consequences that would create credit card debt. And in contrast, the susceptibility model would argue that compulsive buying tendencies might tend to lead to the tendency to get into credit card debt in general, but that for those who are low in concern about immediate consequences, they wouldn't be susceptible to that. So this is essentially two separate models. That this one has more of a focus on concern with future consequences as a potential buffer against tendency to get into credit card debt. And this one focuses on the possibility of concern with immediate consequences as making you susceptible to acting on your compulsive buying tendencies. And so what we essentially wanted to do, very different contexts, very different predictors and outcomes. We wanted to explore whether the buffering model, in other words, future concern with future consequences, might better explain the relationship we found in study 1, or the susceptibility model, concern with immediate consequences. And so, like I said, we recruited participants using Dynata. And in this study, we were interested in behavioral engagement. And so we wanted to sort of bring everybody to the same place where climate change was something that was on their mind. And so we prompted all participants to engage in a writing task about climate change before answering the survey questions. And then we asked them questions. So we asked them what year they were born, and we used that to calculate age. We subtracted the year they were born from 2019. We asked them 14 items about consideration of future consequences. 7 items came from the future subscale. So these would be questions like, often I engage in a particular behavior to achieve outcomes that may not result for many years. And then we also asked them items from the immediate subscale. So things like, I only act to satisfy immediate concerns, figuring the future will take care of itself. And we then asked, again, to make this comparable to study 1, we asked about their political orientation. So we had 2 items asking about social and economic conservatism. These were very strongly correlated with each other, by the way. So people that were identified as socially conservative also tended to identify as economically conservative. And then finally, we asked about climate action intention. So this was more of a behavioral measure, where we asked, to what extent do you intend to engage in these behaviors? So we had these 3 items here. Participate politically to address climate change. We gave some examples. Talk to friends and family members about the importance of addressing climate change, and volunteer or donate money to an organization working to reduce climate change. And these have been items that in general, previous work has shown don't show ceiling or floor effects. So they seemed arguably good choices for this study, so we'd get a good degree of variance. And so the first thing we wanted to look at, the interaction, but before we did that, we wanted to look at the bivariate relationship between age and climate action intentions. And so actually, sorry, I forgot, I was going to show this 0-order correlation table here between all the variables. And essentially what I want to point out here, the reason why I'm showing this is to point out just that these predictors, the 4 predictor variables that are eventually going to be examined, were not strongly related. So you might think, that perhaps older adults might be less concerned about the future on average than younger adults, perhaps because if they're focused on their own life, they might be less concerned about the future on average. We actually didn't find that. We found this relationship is negative in magnitude, but it was not statistically significant. It's a very tiny, essentially 0. So there was no relationship between age and consideration of future consequences. And similarly, there are some significant relationships here, but they're all fairly small in magnitude. So all these things essentially are, by and large, not very highly correlated with each other. Age, the 2 subscales of consideration of future consequences, and political conservatism. None of them are very strongly correlated. And so then we explored the bivariate relationship between age and climate action intentions, which, as you can see here, is, again, not a super strong relationship. It is negative, but not super strong. And when we explored that relationship in more detail, we actually found heteroscedasticity, which essentially means that the variance of the relationship is not constant across all levels of age. And essentially what we found was that the older people were, not only did the average change for how concerned on average they were for climate action intentions, but also the amount of variability was higher for older adults. So there were some older adults that were very, very unconcerned about climate change, or very, very unlikely to take action on climate change. And there were other older adults who reported fairly high action intentions. Whereas with younger adults, they were more centered around the average for their age. And so we explored this using what's called location scale regression, which essentially allows us to explore heteroscedasticity by mapping out both the average in like a normal bivariate regression and changes in variability. And so, like I said, essentially what we found is that for people that were 1 standard deviation below the average relative to their age group, there was a pretty sharp decline. So the older adults that were not engaged, they really weren't engaged relative to younger adults. But for the older adults that were 1 standard deviation above average for their age group, they were statistically just as engaged as the younger adults that were 1 standard deviation above average for their age group. So this line was, I believe, the slope of this line was p equals 0.07. So it wasn't statistically significant. Potentially sloping downwards a little bit, but not statistically significant. So for the adults, as you start getting into the 80th or 85th percentile of how likely are you to take action relative to other people your age, for folks that are in that 80th or 85th percentile, there's no effect of age on that line. And so this was sort of interesting, suggesting greater variability amongst older adults, which we didn't predict this in advance, but it does sort of make sense, right? It makes sense that as older adults, as you age, and you might have a greater tendency to tune things out that don't feel emotionally meaningful, that factors such as that could play a greater role in how likely you are to intend to take actions on climate change. Perhaps many of these folks are folks for which taking action on climate change feels emotionally meaningful. And so then we looked at main effects and interactions in a regression analysis. And I'm going to point you over here to these standardized coefficients, just because these seem very small, because age, this is essentially saying that for every year somebody gets older, they're 0.008 points less likely to intend taking action on climate change, which is not super useful because age is on a metric from like 18 to 98. And so focusing over here on the standardized coefficients as rough measures of effect size, and we see overall, there's a fairly significant but weak relationship between age and intentions to take action. There's a very strong main effect of consideration of future consequences, no effect of immediate consequences. But when we get down here into the interactions, this is where things get interesting. We see that all these interactions between age and CFCF is significant. The interaction between age and consideration of immediate consequences is significant. And then also the interaction controlling for those two, the interaction between age and political conservatism is significant. And so exploring these in simple slope plots, we found essentially that for those who are 1 standard deviation above average on CFCF, so that's this solid line here, there was no relationship between age and intentions to take action. So this is a flat line, not significantly different from 0. And for those that were 1 standard deviation below the average in CFCF, there's a pretty strong relationship between age and willingness to take action. So in other words, this supports the buffering model. This supports that if there is a negative relationship between age and intentions to take action, that thinking about the future buffers against that relationship. And over here, we also find support, essentially, this is a bit more tricky, but we essentially find support for the susceptibility model. where we find that, as we predicted, for those who are 1 standard deviation above the average in consideration of immediate consequences, age has a negative relationship with intentions to take action. And for those that are 1 standard deviation below the average in consideration of immediate consequences, there's no relationship between age and intentions to take action. Surprisingly, and we didn't predict this in advance, it looks like for those who are younger, that there's actually a positive relationship between how much you're focused on the present and how likely you are to intend to take action on climate change. So this pattern here was a bit, we did not predict this in advance, but otherwise these two graphs tend to support the hypotheses and predictions that we made. And this is presented in a little bit different way, but this is looking at the interaction of age and political conservatism on climate action intentions. So we essentially find that as people get older, there tends to be a stronger relationship between political conservatism and intention to take action. And so we weren't focused on this as a primary hypothesis, but this is also sort of consistent with socio-emotional selectivity theory. If you take the assumption that in the US, that for political liberals, climate change might feel more emotionally meaningful than for political conservatives, that perhaps as people get older, the relationship between being conservative and climate action intentions gets more negative, which is what we see. We see that for people younger than about 23 or so, the relationship between between political conservatism and climate action intentions is not statistically significant. So wrapping up on this, preliminary thoughts. These findings are consistent with the tenets of socio-emotional selectivity theory. This is certainly not a causal demonstration of that. These are all correlational findings, but they're at least consistent with what we would have expected to find. This is also consistent with other work done by Daryl Cameron at Penn State that suggests that many people choose not to empathize with other people as a sort of intentional cognitive process, that we often choose not to engage with negative things such as empathizing with other people because we recognize that it's going to be unpleasant. And so this suggests that perhaps that present-oriented older adults may be the ones who are most likely to choose not to engage with climate change. And it could be worth conducting future work to examine whether making climate change feel more emotionally meaningful can be useful for engaging with older adults. So again, these are not conclusions from the present work. These are directions for future research. But I would certainly argue that there might be a need for more research that's done with older populations to think about how older adults can be engaged with climate change. Perhaps some of the work on legacy motives, perhaps that could be extended to older adults, thinking about how older adults might be particularly concerned about their legacies and how that can be made salient. There's other work looking at how people's children can be some of the most powerful persuaders for their parents on taking action on climate change. And so, these social relationships might be particularly important for older adults because as you get older, you tend to prioritize, often many older adults tend to prioritize social relationships. And then finally, again, I want to stress that emotional meaningfulness is not just about hedonic consequences. It's not just about positive affect, but that is an important part of it. And so perhaps helping people recognize that engaging in climate action can feel good and can feel positive, making that more clear could be motivational, especially for older adults. And in addition to those directions, I also wanted to talk about, I think, like I said, none of this work is experimental. None of it shows causality. And so all of this is correlational. I think there needs to be, a fair amount of work looking at experimental designs and longitudinal studies that look at change over time. And one thing that could be of interest to focus on is looking at age effects, the effect of getting older versus cohort effects, the effect of different generations growing up with different sort of experiences. And so socio-emotional selectivity theory is fundamentally a theory of age effects, right? It's primarily a theory of how people change as they get older. But I think there is also a very important room for cohort effects here, because the ways that we grow up and what we learn, what we're exposed to, might fundamentally influence what we perceive to be emotionally meaningful as we age. And so there could be sort of an interaction between age effects and cohort effects. A third consideration is thinking about those who perceive climate change as a present issue. So I focused across these two studies, and primarily in Europe and the US, in the Western context, where many people see climate change as a future issue. But some work, for example, this work that's done interviews with people in the Peruvian Andes, has found that many people in many regions of the world, such as this region, perceive climate change as something affecting them in the present. And so it's unclear whether these results would extend to people such as them. And finally, I think we need better measure development for emotional meaningfulness. We need to more directly study emotional meaningfulness, which we did not include a great measure of that in our present work. So thank you for that. And I see I have some questions in chat, so I'll be happy to take those.
Thanks so much, Nathan. It was a great talk.
Thank you.
So yeah, it looks like we do have at least one question, and there might be some more in the next couple of minutes, but we'll go ahead and start with that first one, which comes from Kathleen, and she's asking about intergenerational impacts. And so the question is, does phrasing climate change in terms of intergenerational impacts, or using that wording, does that change kind of the calculus here? Would that potentially change the effect? And so I think what she's getting at is, number one, did you examine the relationship between age and intergenerational climate effects? And are older adults with children or grandchildren, do you think, more likely to take action on climate change?
Yeah, I think those are really great questions. I don't have the answers to those. I think that my sort of tentative thoughts, my speculation on this, we did not collect data on this, and we don't have the answers to that. I think that tentatively, and I say this based on the work that showed that, as I mentioned, there was other work that showed that people's children could be, really persuasive in changing their parents' minds on climate change. And so I think tentatively we could speculate that perhaps that it's possible that maybe older adults with children or grandchildren might be likely to take action on climate change if they saw that as something, if they were thinking about that, if that was salient and they saw that as something important to their loved ones, they might be more likely to take action on climate change. But I think we need more work on that. I think there's a lot of questions here that are actually really great future research questions. So I'm glad you asked them.
Yeah, I think it's a good question too, and an open one. I agree. There's a question, or maybe more of a comment in the chat from Johnny, and first commending your presentation, saying you did great. It was another great presentation from you. And he mentions that, or the question is, can we also argue that hedonic and eudaimonic is not really a bipolar scale, and that we need to acknowledge that it's a spectrum of experience that's weighted by person?
Yeah. So yeah, I don't want to get into too much detail on this, mainly because I honestly don't know enough. This is not that the hedonia versus eudaimonia is not enough in my field of expertise, so I'll leave that up to other people. I think yeah, certainly you're right that there's a lot of complexity here, and I think that what's really important to acknowledge is just that the way that we value the way that we prioritize these different things in life might differ cross-culturally. So I think that can be, there can be many ways in which that differs. I completely agree with, the idea of it being a spectrum of experience, though. So I think that's a great way to phrase it.
Yeah. Another question in the Q&A, this is from an anonymous attendee. It is, the intent to take action on climate change may or may not translate into actual action. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so there's been I mean, I think this is definitely something that is a weakness of a lot of research, just a lot of research that has been done that often we often don't measure action in a lot of our studies, right? We measure self-reported behavior, or sometimes we'll measure, intentions to engage in behavior, which can be, even further from actual action. And there can be a number of reasons why intentions to engage in action or self-reported action may not always align with actual action. I think that's definitely a weakness with a lot of research. There have been a couple meta-analyses that have argued that a lot of these things tend to at least be strongly correlated. They're not measuring the exact same thing, but they tend to be very strongly correlated often, according to these meta-analyses. But there could certainly be moderators. And so one concern that we had was based on the idea that CFCI, in other words, consideration of immediate consequences, is associated with low self-control. We were wondering, well, is it possible that some of these folks that are high in CFCI might plan to take action, but might not actually take that action, right? Maybe they don't actually follow through. So I think that's definitely, a possible weakness with our work.
All right. Well, it looks like, Nathan, that's the end of our questions. I just wanted to thank you again, and I wanted to make a quick plug for a follow-up that's occurring right after this talk. For those of you who are students who may be listening now, our Division 34 Student Committee is hosting a discussion right afterward. I put the Zoom link into the chat, and so if you have questions or you want to just kind of talk about some of these issues that Dr. Geiger presented, this will be a great opportunity for you to meet other students who have similar interests and just to chat about this work. So I highly encourage you to attend. All students are invited. And I think that about does it. Thank you again, Nathan, for presenting your excellent work in this forum. We appreciate it. Oh, there was one more. Oh, something else just came in. The question is pretty simple. Is the climatic change article open access that you here?
So yeah, that's a good question. I don't believe that the final version is open access. There should be an open access version available. It's an earlier draft, but it's essentially pretty close to the final version. There should be a version of that available online. So I'd be happy to share.
Excellent. All right. Thank you all. Thanks for attending. And we'll be back next month with Janet Swim at the end of June. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all again at that talk.